we had there we I don't know.
Welcome to a special bonus edition of the D3 Datacast here, following the release of regional ranking number 2. And before we get into that, Matt, there's just one little quick thing I wanted to make reference to, and that is the fact that we have the second Hope Calvin game tonight, and both communities have come together and asked fans to not wear their usual maroon and gold or blue and orange, but to wear green in support of the Michigan State senseless
Community.
tragedy that happened there, in support of Michigan State. So I just wanted to note that off the top, because we can get into the weeds sometimes in debating winning percentage versus SOS and regional rankings. But for all the lessons that basketball can teach and what a great game it is, sometimes one of those lessons is that basketball is not actually the most important thing. And so, especially a topic like this where we're kind of debating what ultimately are minor details. Just wanted to recognize that and kind of frame that this whole thing in that context. That there are bigger things out there to worry about.
Yes, committee rankings are not the biggest problem in this world. There are actual problems in the world that we're dealing with, and we need to remember that sometimes.
But that being said, we do love regional rankings. We predicted them, and we got the actual release yesterday. And well, Matt, I don't think it went as well as our first set of predictions, but let's get into it. We'll talk about it along the way. Here we go, Region 1.
Yeah, before we dive in, I think it was interesting. We went through all the ones that we missed were the picks that you made, Zach, and I think all the ones we got were the picks I made. So
Yeah,
I think
that was
that's the
definitely a
yeah, that's
good
the
point.
thing. So we'll dive into Region 1. I just kind of color coded our prediction slides. So green was a team that appeared in the correct slot. Yellow was a team that ended up ranked, but we had them in the incorrect slot. And red was a team that did not end up being ranked. So in Region 1 here, it ended up being the same 7 teams that were in the alphabetical list from the week before. We thought maybe Worcester State would slide in and Trinity, Connecticut would fall out, but that was not the case. So Trinity, Connecticut was in the 7th spot. And then the other thing that happened was Wesleyan was ended up above Tufts, and we think that was because there was a head-to-head win there. We had kind of discounted that a little bit because there was also like a triangle situation with another team on the list. I think it was maybe Hamilton, but probably the committee wasn't comparing Hamilton at the same time. So if you're just comparing Tufts and Wesleyan, then the head-to-head becomes a larger factor. So they made the switch with Wesleyan there, and that was Region 1. Region 2 was I think the only region that we had gotten completely correct. The big change from week 1 was Emerson sliding in and Babson sliding out. And I think that was largely on the strength of their 2-5 record versus regionally ranked opponents, whereas Babson had not had a regionally ranked win. Now, this sets up an interesting situation next week where Emerson will lose a regionally ranked win against Babson, and Babson will pick up a regionally ranked win against Emerson. So we'll have to see how things fall out next week. But I don't think there's anything in Region 2 that was too shocking or surprising.
No, the first few regions here we're okay with. Even Region 3, get into Region 3 here. It's just a matter of flipping 2 teams at the bottom.
Yeah, let's do that. Let's get into Region 3. We had all these teams in. We had just had flopped Brockport and Ithaca. I think the committee must have liked Ithaca's strength of schedule advantage and their additional regionally ranked win, their additional 1-1 versus regionally ranked opponents, whereas we had favored Brockport's win over Oswego State, who was the top team in this region, and we thought that might elevate them and a significant point, almost 9.09 winning percentage gap. So one thing we don't really quite know, since the first week's rankings were alphabetical, Zach, does the committee still have a hidden order that they're weighing these against? I suspect probably yes, based on what we're going to see maybe in Region 8 in particular. Or are they just saying you get regionally ranked win credit for the first week, and so that way maybe Oswego doesn't look any better than Hamilton or RPI, and we won't really see that ordering until next week where we can see top teams in the region. So I don't really know exactly how they view that piece of criteria at this point.
Yeah, I think based on what we have heard is, even though they were released alphabetically, the committee had some sort of ordered or knew how the regions kind of stacked up top to bottom. But like you said, in some of the areas where things went against our expectation, one of the possible answers for how that happened is maybe they were viewing all RROs a little bit more uh, similar and not really digging in as much to who was beating teams at top of regions, things like that. So I don't know if we're still um, it's still in a phase where there's still some early ranking oddness that needs to get worked out, and so it's really not going to be until region 3, or excuse me, regional ranking 3, that we get a real picture. I think the expectation was that this set would be a fairly good representation of the full committee interpretation of the data, their philosophy, and how they're coming out. But yeah, it's a little interesting to see some of these things. We definitely thought that Oswego State win over Brockport would be a real credit to them, where that one win in the RRO category would look better than some of the other
Yeah.
RROs, like you mentioned with Ithaca. But it seems like, at least so far, the committee is not viewing it that way. So that will definitely be something to watch heading into next week's rankings.
Yeah. Looking over at Region 4, this was another one we had gotten fairly correct. The big difference was Kane and Lancaster Bible switch spots. And I dug into this one a little bit, maybe something we should have done previously. There's a big difference in non-conference strength of schedule here. So if they had gone to the secondary criteria, I think Kane's NCSOS is below 500, and Lancaster Bibles was like close to 580, 560, 580 maybe. I didn't write down the numbers, but I think that maybe was significant enough that with how tight they are in the other criteria to make the flip. So I completely understand that. And if that was something I had identified, on Sunday while I was doing rankings instead of watching the Super Bowl, then maybe I would have come up to the same conclusion as the committee.
Yeah, and I think I like that. I don't know how often that happens, but that's a good possible explanation here with the numbers in winning percentage and strength of schedule so close. If you go to that non-conference SOS to try to suss out, okay, is there a reason we can reward a team for what they did in
Yeah,
non-conference who otherwise might be punished because they're in a weaker conference, right? We definitely see that between the conferences involved here with the NJAC and the United East, right? So they're ending up with
yeah,
very similar strength of schedules, but it's clear Lancaster Bible went out and played the better non-conference schedule, so it's that conference slate which they don't necessarily control, that's dragging it down. Whereas Kane just gets the benefit of being in the stronger league and having that SOS get there as a result.
yeah. And I like that as a tiebreaker, right? Because as you said, you're not really rewarding or punishing teams for playing in a stronger or weaker conference. Their resume is going to end up pretty much the same. So then, okay, given that we essentially have a tie or close to a tie, who was the one that ended up challenging themselves in the non-conference in the this portion of the schedule they can really control? And I think in this case it was Lancaster Bible. Going up to Region 5, this was kind of the first one where we had some major discrepancies. Um, After Swarthmore and Johns Hopkins, which I think was easy to see as the top two, then we had the right teams, but in a completely wrong order. I think the committee had ended up going. Maybe you can read it, Zach, because you'll probably have it correct.
Yeah. So, well, we did well at the top there, Matt. So, congratulations to us.
Yeah.
So, but there 3 through 7 went Widener, Alvernia, Susquehanna 5th, Catholic, and then Muhlenberg 7th. So
Yes.
not exactly sure how they got into it. It's obvious things to point out, though, is Susquehanna has a season sweep over Catholic.
Yeah.
Now, that's definitely something we knew as we were doing this, but we didn't necessarily maybe group them close enough to think that that would come into play. Um, but yeah, here we are.
Yeah, I think that maybe tells us that these teams are lumped very closely together in the committee's mind, and so they were kind of using some of these things to break through the cluster here, I guess. So yeah, we were kind of surprised to see those two head to heads for Susquehanna overcome that large winning percentage gap with Catholic, but that's what happened. And we had kind of seen Muhlenberg sneaking into the rankings, and so the committee did that as well. I should say I should apologize. I was saying Susquehanna during the last week's recording, and it is Susquehanna. In my defense, I had looked up a video of a British guy saying it, and it sounded like he had said Hana. So can't trust the British, I guess. But it's Susquehanna.
Yeah, if they were in the United Kingdom, they would definitely be a Region 10 team.
Yeah,
That would make them an island school. So
yeah. But Region 5 here, not an island.
no.
All right, Region 6. Region 6 was another region we had gotten all of the teams, but we had a couple of flipped orders. The committee liked maybe the Hampton Sydney head to head over Christopher Newport and flipped them there. That's something we had talked about. I had thought maybe Christopher Newport was far enough ahead in the winning percentage and a little bit of a strength of schedule gap to maybe avoid that. But, I guess fair enough here for Hampton Sydney. And then the other one, which was a slight surprise to me, was Guilford and Emory flipping. I think this is one of the things we're seeing the committee really, really likes strength of schedule, and Emory has a really high strength of schedule. So even though Guilford has a 0.14 advantage in the winning percentage, this was still overcome. Emory also does have an additional regionally ranked win playing in the UAA. They can get a lot of those. So, but also in a bunch more attempts. So they both have, actually Guilford has a slightly better ratio of wins per attempt. Emory has a ton of attempts, and they've come up with 3. So I don't know. I actually don't know if the committee's really crediting them for the extra RRO win there, given how many extra attempts they had. But I guess it seems like they are, and again, fair enough. But this one was a little bit surprising to me. Also, we see here that Barry, for example, had beaten Emory, and Guilford had beaten Emory, but neither of those head-to-head wins were enough to overcome it in this case. So I don't know. Compare this to Region 5, where the head-to-head win was enough to overcome it for the low winning percentage, high SOS team when Susquehanna came above Catholic, but it wasn't enough to overcome it for the high winning percentage, lower SOS team in either of the cases here. So another view of that maybe the committee is very highly valuing strength of schedule kind of as a standalone criteria.
Oh boy, we'll get to that.
Well, should we get to that now?
Well, yeah. Let's talk about Region 7 overall, and then we'll get into it.
Region 7. This was one of the largest surprises for me. This was definitely one of the first places that you and I are going to look in the whole region because we're Calvin fans. So before we start this conversation, we'll just say that out front. We're obviously Calvin supporters. So there are probably people who are just going to dismiss what we have to say because they think that we're just going to favor Calvin, and that's fair. But what I'd say is don't ever believe something just because I say it or because someone else says it. Think about your evidence and your facts and come up with your own conclusions based on that. So completely understand if you're going to discount what I say as being a Calvin supporter. But here, the big surprise at the top was that Mount Union was number 1 and John Carroll was number 2. So Zach, what are your thoughts there? Oh no,
Well,
that was a close decision. We don't really care about that one.
but it's an indication that maybe they're not looking into the quality of the RROs quite as much. Mount Union had the 3-1 versus John Carroll's 2-1. And even when we did the predictions, we talked about this, setting up a scenario where it was kind of a quality versus quantity, right? So we put John Carroll because we valued the Wheaton win higher than what Mount Union had. Now, it wouldn't necessarily come into direct consideration, but knowing that Whitworth was going to be dropping out, that was falling off. So maybe that's a bigger consideration going into regional ranking 3. But yeah, that Whitworth win we didn't look at very highly. The Worcester win is not bad, but it's not at the level of John Carroll's win at Wheaton. And then the two split against each other, so there wasn't really anything to gain or lose there.
One thing I'll say is if they are close enough to go to the secondary, Mount Union does have a 0.04 advantage on the non-conference strength of schedule. So if that was used to break the tie, I think that's fair. But yeah, I
Right.
would say that they have the better win being Wheaton versus the Worcester and Whitworth comparison. So that's where we had landed as John Carroll number 1.
Right, that also says that they didn't, because you're talking about primary criteria versus secondary criteria at that point, right? So they wouldn't get to the non-conference strength of schedule if they had
Yeah.
already determined that the Wheaton win was a big enough gold chip, if you want to call it that,
Yeah.
to put John Carroll ahead.
Yeah. But I could see them not thinking that. Like maybe a number 3 and a number 7 is equal to a number 1. Like I don't know that specifically, but you could say that's
Right.
close enough where we need to go to the non-conference strength of schedule in the secondary criteria. Because
Right. So
you'll never see a
so
winning percentage and strength of schedule as tight as these two with also splitting the season series against each other. So
right.
that's like a tie, a tie, a tie.
Right. Well, we expect later on, no one would be surprised if there's a rubber match to
Yep.
settle the score.
Yep.
Although at that point, probably one is getting in on the AQ, and the other would be not dealing with the other for a Pool C. Um, but also, so we've talked about this. How highly is the committee regarding a high RR win versus just looking at them similarly? So this would be an indication that maybe they're looking at them more similarly across the board, or yet haven't fully, maybe down the line in the next one they will kind of change that weighting a little bit. We'll
Yeah,
see.
possible. But the real controversy in our mind here in Region 7, joking aside at the top, was Calvin out and Heidelberg in. Heidelberg does have the .43 SOS advantage here, and Calvin had the point, what is it, almost 1.7
Almost 170 points of winning
winning
percentage. Yep.
percentage advantage. Calvin has beaten a number one in the region. Heidelberg has beaten a number one in the region, and then they also have um, a win over Carnegie Mellon, who's in the kind of the middle of the region pack. So the committee decided that 0.043 strength of schedule and an additional kind of mid-tier regionally ranked win was worth 170 points of winning percentage. With more than
Basically,
that, right?
wiping away 4 losses.
Yeah. And if they went to the secondary criteria here, at least where non-conference strength of schedule is concerned, the two teams are very close, but Calvin was very marginally ahead in there. So I don't think, there's other secondary criteria, I guess, as well, but it's probably not a case where they considered it a tie and went to the secondary criteria. Otherwise, we maybe would have seen Calvin ahead. So they decided that on the primary criteria, they wanted to eliminate that 0.17 winning percentage advantage and go with Heidelberg. Now, what we had seen in the past was that about zero point zero 0.03 strength of schedule was about 0.08 winning percentage. If you want to hold that all the way through, then the gap here between Calvin and Heidelberg in strength of schedule would be about 0.12. So then the additional win against Carnegie Mellon, I shouldn't say additional win, that's already baked into the winning percentage and strength of schedule. But the fact that one of the teams they had played was regionally ranked is going to overcome the rest of that 0.05 winning percentage gap. So the 0.03 to 0.08 thing is maybe not real, maybe not a thing they're using anymore. That's something we had seen several years in the past, loosely. 0.03 is equal to 2 wins is kind of how they had described it. But that's kind of what we're talking about here is, because you happened to play Carnegie Mellon, that's going to erase like an additional an additional full win or 2 wins or whatever from your resume because one team happened to be regionally ranked.
Yeah, so this gets into the nuts and bolts of the winning percentage versus strength of schedule debate, right? That they need to be working together, and they, I think, need to be properly contextualized. You don't want to reach a point where a team is the penalty for beating a bad team is greater than the penalty for losing to a good team, right? You don't,
Yeah.
and it feels like we've crossed that point, Matt, which brings us to the next thing. You did a little bit of playing around to kind of um, bring that point to a little bit more of a concrete example.
Yeah, so this was just some things I had posted on Twitter last night as I was trying to process through these results here. So I just took the two schedules of Calvin and Heidelberg, and I said, let's say Heidelberg had the opportunity to beat Alma twice, and Calvin had the opportunity to lose to John Carroll twice because we switched like 2 conference games, right? So if you did that, then their winning percentage would become very similar. Heidelberg would have the 783 to 773 advantage, but Calvin would have the almost 40-point strength of schedule advantage there. And again, still the 1 versus 2 regionally ranked wins. When you just look at that, to me, it's clear, Calvin performed better against their schedule than they did. I went one step further and I just said, let's just say Calvin didn't play Alma twice and Heidelberg didn't play John Carroll twice, so they didn't win those 2 games or lose those 2 games. What happens here? Here we see the strength of schedules come very similar in line. 0.552 for Calvin, 0.526 for Heidelberg. And now we see a big winning percentage gap, 850 against that remaining schedule for Calvin, 762 against the Heidelberg schedule. So to me, both of these two pictures paint the same thing. Heidelberg is getting a lot of credit for losing games to John Carroll, and Calvin is getting dinged a little bit for losing or for winning games to Alma, who's a weaker team in their conference. So Where I come down on this is I understand that it's hard to play John Carroll, and even good teams in the regional rankings might lose to them twice. I understand that a game against Alma shouldn't really boost your resume, and teams that are in the regional ranking consideration are probably going to beat them twice. But at best, you should consider those two things a wash. You shouldn't be saying losses to John Carroll are better than wins against Alma, particularly since these are conference games and it doesn't factor into like a non-conference. It's not like the teams necessarily chose these. So I feel like we've gone too far. I'm a big fan of strength of schedule ideas. I think it's really important to figure out who you're playing to encourage coaches and teams to schedule well outside of their conference and control that as much as possible. But I don't think we want to, particularly when it comes to conference games, just reward teams for losing to quality opponents. So you should get a bigger advantage for losing to John Carroll than you get to for winning against a bottom tier team. And it feels like we've gone past that point with the strength of schedule comparison, where we're zooming teams behind who haven't won as many games up ahead because, well, they played a tougher schedule.
Yeah, and as you mentioned, if you look at that non-conference strength of schedule, um, it was fairly even, and I think you even tweeted that of teams in the general range for consideration to be ranked in Region 7, I think, would you say Calvin had the number 2 overall non-conference strength of schedule? So
Yeah,
this isn't a case
right.
of not going out and playing a strong schedule.
Mm-hmm.
I don't
Yeah,
know. It just feels like, the 505, it's, yes, it's not great. It's not super. It would definitely be their downfall if they were to need a Pool C bid and to miss out on it. But it feels like in this ranking, at least, they're being treated like what we would expect, when a 480
yeah,
strength of schedule gets showed up. Not
yeah.
one that is on the right side of 500.
Right. This isn't the Lancaster Bible situation from whatever it was 5 6 years ago, where their strength of schedule was so low that they shouldn't be considered, even with like a one loss record. This is a team that still has a strength of schedule on the positive side of 500, who has a win against a number one team in a region. Calvin has beaten UW Oshkosh. They've played regionally ranked teams. They've got a win against a good one. Heidelberg does as well, right? These are both teams that are good, and they'd be ranked in a lot of regions. I just don't see how you make this switch based on the criteria. If you're actually, one of the things that I fear is we have these primary criteria and we treat winning percentage and strength of schedule as completely separate criteria. We're not contextualizing them together. I think you should always take them together. And then we're also treating results versus regionally ranked opponents and common opponents and head to head as additional on top of that without recognizing that all of those other results are baked into the strength of schedule and the winning percentage already. So when we need to take all the primary criteria, agree, but we need to contextualize it together and say, what does this all mean as one picture, not just a team's higher in this category, a team's higher in this category, a team's higher in this category. So we have to look at it as one picture. And I feel like maybe we didn't do that in this case.
Right. And again, to try to avoid any dispute from viewers on the grounds of our rooting allegiances here. Two cases. If you kind of play with the schedule to bring winning percentages in line, Calvin comes out with the SOS advantage. If you play with it to bring SOS in line, Calvin comes out with the winning percentage advantage. So I'm just going to come out and say it. If your ranking system leads you to rank Heidelberg above Calvin, you have a problem with your ranking system.
Maybe. Yeah.
Now, I don't think we're talking about a need for totally revamping the primary criteria, but whatever they have in their dynamic tool that allows them to go through this process probably needs some sort of addition to better contextualize, or at least more consistently contextualize winning percentage versus strength of schedule.
Yeah. And another thing I'll add here is this would be another completely different situation if Calvin didn't have like a good regionally ranked win or they hadn't played regionally ranked opponents and Heidelberg had, right? I could see that like, hey, this is maybe a discussion that we're having and one team has played good teams and one team hasn't and one team has a good win and one team doesn't. Like, yeah, there's a difference here. Heidelberg was 2-5 and Calvin was 1-3. So again, they have a bunch of opportunities because Mount Union and John Carroll are in their conference, where Calvin's were all out of conference games that they had to go out and schedule and play. All the regionally ranked games were on the road or neutral site. They didn't play any. Well, actually, no. Oshkosh win was at home, so they had a mix of on the road, neutral site, and at home. Um, But Calvin has played those games. They have scheduled those games. They've gotten a win against a really good team, and but it just feels like all of that's going away because well, Heidelberg had a 43-point advantage in the strength of schedule. That's it's oversimplification. I understand, but that's how it looks and how it feels. Region 8.
Region 8.
Region 8 was one, as we were talking
Hallelujah.
through.
Where's the Tylenol?
I had said St. Norbert was in and Marion was out. And then as we talked through it, I kind of convinced myself that Marion would probably still be in. And we saw
Yeah,
in the end they were still in. The other thing we
right.
missed here was with Carthage and Elmhurst flipped. Now, going back to our last point, or points we had made earlier, I don't fully understand North Central not being in over Marion, given the difference in strength of schedule and winning percentage on their resumes and the additional regionally ranked wins that North Central has under their belt. Now, Marion's regionally ranked win is better, but it feels like if we're looking at this in a Heidelberg versus Calvin conversation, it's not completely apples to apples because Heidelberg also did have a good regionally ranked win in there as well. But to me, it feels like if we're having that same conversation here, this is a larger gap in strength of schedule, and it's a smaller gap in winning percentage than was overcome. And this is two additional regionally ranked wins. So to me, this doesn't feel like it's the same conversation we had from a slide ago. If it was the same conversation, then I think North Central gets slotted in right there, and they're the number 7 teams in this region instead of Marion. So it's and I think we're going to see it again on Region 9, another example of maybe not having the exact same conversation. I don't know if you had additional thoughts on Region 8, though, Zach.
Yeah, no, I agreed with you. As we went through the predictions and we talked through it more, I think I was more convinced, having seen the week 1 where Marion got in. I could see definitely how they would stay in. Again, not having that, I don't think that we would have maybe recognized that, and St. Norbert would be the more obvious pick, but they did it in week 1, so I can see how they did it again in week 2. But that's
Yeah.
about it.
Yeah, and just sort of a little bit interesting with Wisconsin Lutheran being in, but St. Norbert being out, and how similar those resumes are, maybe. Um, but anyway, I mean, I talked myself into Marion being back in, but yeah, who knows? It'd be interesting
Anyway,
to follow this one as we go on, see what continues to happen here. Region 9 is next. Region 9 had a bunch of stuff all over the place. We had gotten UW Oshkosh correct at the top. 2 and 3 were flopped. Carleton came in second. UW La Crosse came in third. Illinois College and Central had completely fallen out. UW Clare was in, what were they, Zach? Maybe as high as 4.
they were
Yeah.
fourth. Yep. Shout
And
out to
then,
Ryan Scott. He commented on Monday's episode saying
yep,
Eau Claire was going to be fourth, and he
yep.
nailed it.
And there's an example. Okay, they have more regionally ranked wins and a higher strength of schedule. So again, I get that. Illinois College and Central had fallen out because Central doesn't have a regionally ranked win. They've only played one regionally ranked team. Illinois College only has one regionally ranked win, and it's not a great one. It's against the number 6. Their strength of schedule is really low. And then St. Mary's popped in with the 609 winning percentage, 531 strength of schedule. They have 3 regionally ranked wins and 2 against the top 2 teams of this region. So I think that's the strength of their regionally ranked wins gets them in. But going back towards the top of this list, Zach, Carleton being number 2 and UW La Crosse being number 3, again, doesn't
Yeah.
completely feel consistent to me to the conversation we had with Heidelberg and Calvin. Compare Carleton's resume to Calvin's resume. It's very similar. They're 2-0 versus regionally ranked. That's good, but they don't have a really good regionally ranked win. Those are both kind of back half of regional ranking wins. Whereas 3 of the 4 teams Calvin played are in like the top 4 of their region, top half teams, including their win against number 1. But it feels like Carleton's resume is very, very similar to maybe that resume of Calvin, but they're coming
Yeah.
up in number 2 of the region above UW La Crosse, who has a higher strength of schedule, and but we didn't see that in Region 7. And again, they're not completely apples to apples comparisons because La Crosse doesn't have a great regionally ranked win either. But again,
No, but
the gaps in
uh,
strength of schedule and winning percentage,
right,
are smaller than what we saw overcome with Calvin.
right. Carleton's advantage over La Crosse in winning percentage is smaller than Calvin's over Heidelberg, and um, Carleton's SOS deficit to lacrosse is actually a little bit greater than Calvin's to Heidelberg. So this was one I immediately saw that this doesn't look like a consistent result. Now you mentioned the differences in the RRO, but we're talking about 170 points of winning percentage versus here 120 points of winning percentage was enough to overcome a bigger SOS deficit.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know. I don't get it.
Yeah.
Now, Matt, I don't. We don't have a lot of answers here, but it might be worth bringing up. There was a lot of confusion when the regional rankings were first posted because we got the teams listed with what rank they were in, but then the data that accompanies it when they published the regional rankings with the records, they didn't match up. And so one of the thoughts was maybe there was something got mixed up when what we were seeing was the final rankings, but that as we were trying to match up like whose record is actually listed here, like for instance, at the bottom of region 7, it said Heidelberg, but Calvin's record was listed.
Yeah, very clearly.
Right. So one of the thoughts was, well, is this a glimpse at how they ranked the teams last week, or was this maybe the RAC submitted their rankings and then the national committee went through and made some changes, and so we're seeing how maybe teams either moved out and someone else got moved in or got moved around. So there's a lot of questions with what exactly was going on, and maybe an indication that the RACs were acting a little bit differently than how the national committee wanted everyone to act. I don't know, but there is a lot it seems to be sorted out between now and what we see in week 3.
And if that was the answer for the suspicious winning percentage or records on the site, I think Pat Coleman tweeted out the theory that maybe that was the order that the RAC submitted, and then the national committee had changed some of the teams at the end. We don't know if that was the case. But if it was, it's then interesting to see that there's some of these apparent inconsistencies in how we're rating teams. The national committee should be going through and making changes to make sure the regions are more consistent, not less consistent. And it kind of appeared, I don't know if they made a change at the top of this region or whatever, but it does seem in 7, 8, and 9 on some of these different positions, we're not always weighing the criteria the same necessarily. And we should say that's what happens. The regional committees submit their rankings. The national committees get together. One member of the regional committee is on the national committee, so they kind of talk about their region where they might have struggled. Maybe the discussion. Maybe they said, "Hey, we had Heidelberg and Calvin really close. Let's talk about this." And then maybe the national committee changes it. That's part of the process. So that's what happens. But that consistency, that's part of the national committee's job, is to make sure that the consistency is applied all the way across the country, and that all the regions are being kind of treated the criteria in the same way.
So just to wrap up Region 9 here, because it was kind of a mess if you look at all the yellow and red on our predictions here, just to list it in the actual order for week 2 here, we have Oshkosh at the top, Carleton, UW La Crosse, Eau Claire, Bethany Lutheran was 5th, Whitewater 6th, and St. Mary's, Minnesota 7th. All right. Region 10.
Region 10. We had gotten all the teams. The order at the bottom was a little bit different. So St. Thomas, Texas 1, Mary Hardin Baylor 2, Pomona Pitzer 3, Claremont Mud Scripts 4. To me, this was kind of apparent to see as it went on. Also, take a look at Claremont Mud Scripts. That resume is very similar to Calvin, so Calvin would be highly ranked in this region as well. They would be either right above or right below Claremont Mud Scripts, FYI. And then at the end, we had Texas Dallas, then East Texas Baptist, Redlands. And the order was swapped. So the committee went East Texas Baptist 5, then Redlands 6, then Texas Dallas 7, I believe.
That's correct. Yeah.
And then, as we predicted, Whitworth would be out of the rankings. They were in the alphabetical, but they suffered some losses, and their resume doesn't look quite as good as it did the week before.
Well, and Redlands I think
up.
Yeah, I think we expected that regardless of what they were going to do, because Redlands was picking up the RROs that weren't factored in for week 1.
Yep, and good quality RROs.
Right.
So, anyway, that's the regions. A little bit of a mixed bag for us as far as our predictions go.
Yep. But that leads into what we have coming up Thursday night, which on a special edition, or I guess it's Hoopsville's regular scheduled time, but the entire episode is going to be dedicated to a special episode revealing how the national committee see the top 16 in the men's and women's um seasons. That will be based on these regional rankings, which, given the some of the inconsistencies and maybe questions if they're fully considering all of the aspects of the criteria as we were expecting, that maybe this won't be as informative or as instructive to um, later Pool C conversations as we would hope it would be, but still it'll be interesting to see nonetheless. And based based on that, based on these regional rankings, we went through the exercise of putting together how we see the top 16 so that we can make our predictions and check it against what really comes out, just like we do with our regional rankings.
Yeah, we made our list, but we did not check it twice. We only checked it once. So the process we went through is, and I don't know how the committee actually does this, but we went through a sort of Pool C like selection where we kind of crossed all the teams off and put the top team based on the rankings that we had seen publicly, put the top team from each region on the board, and then we went through and thought, okay, who are we going to pick based on these resumes that we see? Full disclosure, we did this in about 15 minutes. We didn't dig deep. I think the committee's going to take longer than that. So maybe our rankings should be considered directional. Like these are not the 100% gospel predictions. It's only probably 99% that. But we went through yeah, about 15 minutes before the show and picked out our order. Our order.
Yeah, so Randolph-Macon was a pretty easy number one there, Matt, and I think we pretty quickly put St. Joseph, Connecticut, their number two. I'm actually surprised how strong that SOS has stayed given their getting into GNAC play. But with what they did in non-conference and that SOS staying fairly strong, uh, they're easily a top four, for to build a quadrant around in the tournament, and a pretty easy selection for us at number two.
Yep. Yeah, then we had some discussion with Swarthmore and Middlebury next. We ended up going Swarthmore, then Middlebury. I think um, even though Middlebury's strength of schedule is a little bit higher and they have a couple more regionally ranked wins, they Swarthmore's won more games, higher winning percentage, and we liked their win against um, was it Johns Hopkins better maybe than a win Middlebury had. Well, Middlebury has the win over Keene State, so they have a good win as well. So we liked their winning percentage gap, I think, primarily on this. But we could see that maybe going either way as far as 3 versus 4.
Yeah,
Um,
and then direct there going Mount Union and John Carroll. And as we were talking about this, we going back to our predictions for the week 2 regional rankings, we still prefer John Carroll, but
yeah.
as we see, Mount Union was ranked ahead of John Carroll, so we would expect that when they're doing a top 16, that Mount Union would be ahead of John Carroll. I don't know why they would all of a sudden deviate since this is going to be based on the same data, but they come right off the board
Yes.
in a row here. So
And
maybe it doesn't really matter.
our understanding is that they're going to base the top 16 off of the data sheets that we had seen released, so off of the rankings. We're not updating the regionally ranked opponents, or we didn't update the regionally ranked opponents based on who we just saw ranked. Um, I think once we did look at the numbers that way, and we liked John Carroll especially at that point above, because I think they added 1 or 2 regionally ranked wins. Well, 2, yeah, they got 2 from Heidelberg, and I think Mount Union lost a regionally ranked win
Yeah,
in the
they
process.
Whitworth falling
Yeah.
out. Yep.
So anyway, that'll be interesting to see. Maybe these 2 teams came in a little higher than I expected to see through our quick process here. I thought maybe they'd be more like 8, 9, but they came in right next. I mean, the resumes are so similar that if you pick one, you almost have to pick the next one right after. So they're gonna be tied together. After those 2 OAC schools, we went with Williams. Just kind of like one of the best combinations of winning percentage, strength of schedule left, and they also had 5 regionally ranked wins. So that kind of stuck out to us. We were looking at Williams next, and then St. Thomas, Texas. Once they were remaining on the board, we didn't really have any teams remaining with 900 winning percentages and strength of schedules north of 550. I don't think they only have 3 regionally ranked wins, which could count against them at this point. And they're not super great regionally ranked wins, but they've won all of their opportunities. So we slotted them in, a little bit high here at the 8 spot.
Yeah, and we should also note that we're doing this kind of through how we value SOS, and if it turns out that maybe we're a little bit light on that compared to what we've seen in this week's regional rankings, and if the same approach, maybe Williams does slot up ahead of a Mount Union and John Carroll.
Mhm.
Um, but hey, these are our predictions. This is our view of it.
Yeah, and if they really value quantity of RROs, we can go down to our 9 and 10 spots here. We had Rowan and
Yep.
Stockton. They both have a bunch of RROs, primarily from playing in the NJAC. The committee might put them as high as 5, like 5-6. They're another kind of pair that are probably going to be close together given their resumes. In fact, you typically switch them, except for the fact that Rowan's beaten Stockton twice, I think. So they're going to probably come in together. So you could see them maybe as high as 5-6 if they really like the quantity of RROs there. That's a possibility. But like Zach said, we kind of took this sort of hybrid approach of what do we value and what do we like for compared, and then also a little bit in mind of what do we think the committee is going to do as well, and try to marry those together. But after those two NJACs, Rowan 9, Stockton 10, we liked Wheaton. Wheaton has 870 winning percentage, 565 strength of schedule. 4-3 versus regionally ranked opponents, although they're going to lose the Calvin regionally ranked win because they are not in the ranking for the next year or next week. So they'll eventually lose that. And then maybe at number 12 was our first really surprising inclusion. What would you say that's correct, Zach?
Yeah, I think we even got to the point with Wheaton where we were talking maybe Case. Now I think that wouldn't. I like Wheaton above Case because I feel like if you don't want to take the RROs and jump Wheaton when Wheaton has the winning percentage and strength of schedule advantage. I feel like if to do that would be kind of be double counting,
Mm-hmm.
or giving Case more credit when they have SOS disadvantage there. So Wheaton has played a strong schedule. You're just looking at a difference of who happens to be ranked or not ranked, and certainly the UAA has that interesting dynamic where most of their conference schedule is going to be played against regionally ranked opponents.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah,
but yeah, I think Case came in probably 11 when we were really starting to talk about it, and then you could make a case that maybe they should be lower, but yeah,
yeah. We kind of had a
the eight,
Case and Oswego discussion here with the strength of
yeah,
schedule being so similar. Oswego's got a 0.6-ish advantage in the winning percentage, but the quantity of regionally ranked wins for Case is high. Interesting. An interesting case for Case will be that their non-conference strength of schedule is only like 400. So if they ever are looking at secondary criteria for this type of a thing, they're going to come out very low on some of those discussions. But because they've played and played well in UAA play, they've gotten a bunch of regionally ranked wins, and I believe those are entirely in conference. Is that correct, Zach?
let's see if I can double check that really quick.
You're probably not
Case.
prepared. Um, so while you
Yes,
check
I
it,
believe so. Carnegie Mellon, Emory, Rochester, Wash U.
yeah. So they've got a bunch of
I
wins
mean, they
against,
played such a weak
yeah,
non-conference schedule that yeah.
right. Yeah, their resume is entirely UAA, and that's a really strong conference. You're going to build a good resume there. So we think that they could be as high as 12. Then we went Oswego 13, and Keene State 14. Keene State, that winning percentage is hanging out there as one of the best in this whole list, but their strength of schedule is only marginal for this type of a discussion in top 16, and only 2-1 versus regionally ranked. Those two wins are to Western Connecticut, I believe, and their losses to Middlebury. So I could maybe see Keene State falling entirely out of the top 16. For me at this point, though, the 957 against a 525 is good enough to be on this list, kind of almost no matter what. So I would kind of like to see them in, but they would be at the back half of the back kind of quarter of my top 16, and I wouldn't be surprised if the committee ultimately had them out. And then we had a very interesting discussion at 15, 16. We ended up going with Hampton Sydney from the ODAC. Their resume looked kind of one of those strong across the board resumes. We kind of compared them to Wash U. Okay, Wash U has 7-5 versus regionally ranked opponents versus 4-3 for Hampton Sydney, but Hampton Sydney's got a 50-point advantage in the winning percentage. You could see maybe them going Wash U, but it's a bunch more opportunities for those regionally ranked wins. We picked Hampton Sydney, and then once Hampton Sydney was in, that put Christopher Newport on the board, and suddenly their resume looked to me like fairly clearly the strongest resume. Even comparing them to Wash U, is they compare a little bit more favorably there. Um,
Right.
So then Christopher Newport got our 16th spot, where we thought we might be having like the Wash U versus UW Oshkosh conversation at that point, but that didn't really happen once Christopher Newport came onto the board.
Yeah. And again, this in our predictions, we had Christopher Newport ahead of Hampton Sydney, so that maybe would have changed the discussion at 16. But using what actually came out for this week with Hampton Sydney ahead of Christopher Newport, we the committee ranked Hampton Sydney ahead of Newport, so we would expect that they would, if they both made a top 16, that they would be ahead.
So looking at this list that we just came up with, if I was to make one prediction about our predictions being wrong, it would be Keene State out, Wash U in. But it's based on what we have seen from the rankings and how they're valuing strength of schedule and regionally ranked quantity of wins. I think they're probably going to discount Keene State based on the 525, 2-1, and they're going to put in Wash U, who has a 0.18 deficit in winning percentage there, but because of the stronger strength of schedule and the more regionally ranked games played, I can really see that happening. So that would be my one prediction of where, like, if I could pick one team where we're going to be wrong versus the committee, I think it would be that. I'm sure we'll get order wrong and other things too, but that's my prediction on the prediction.
That's interesting though, because if you're going to say Wash U, you got to talk Oshkosh because they have the winning percentage advantage and the strength of
Yeah.
schedule advantage. So if you want to say Wash U, I'll say Oshkosh.
Okay. There we go. Yeah, I think if we extended this list, right, I think Wash U and Oshkosh are probably in some order our next two. Mary Hardin Baylor is probably also in that mix if you're looking for like a through 19. Johns Hopkins, probably around that list. What the committee would do with a team like Rochester is I really have no idea.
Well, I think there's a big difference there when you're talking Pool C selection versus top 16 resume.
Yeah.
So being the 640 SOS is great, but the six, well, then again, who knows? We've been talking this whole time how it appears that they're valuing SOS really highly, so who knows? But Johns Hopkins is another one that we kept bringing up. It seems like maybe starting around the middle of these rankings, it just seemed like there was always one other one that we decided we liked a little bit better.
Yeah.
So maybe they're another one that could sneak in there, but.
And having a win over Swarthmore, I think could mean a whole lot, but only two
Yeah.
regionally ranked wins. That might hurt them based on what we're seeing from some of the resumes and some of the resumes we've seen on the board.
There we go. So be sure to tune into Hoopsville on Thursday night to see how the committee actually has their top 16. And I'm sure there will be a little bit more discussion about maybe some of the thought process. And maybe not in specific cases, but just in general, that would be really interesting to hear. So looking forward to that. I know Dave McHugh will do a great job as we hear from our two national committee chairs.
And yeah, it's great that the national committee chairs are doing that and putting out the top 16. Mm-hmm. It's great information. It's great fun for us fans. And choosing a show like Hoopsville, who's been invested in the D3 community they're celebrating 20 seasons. I think that's a great place for it too. So props to the committees for coming on and for hosting it at Hoopsville. I think that's tremendous.
I think we'll leave it for there. Let us know what you think about the second regional rankings and our top 16 predictions. And we will be back next week.
Good job, team.